What is up, guys? Nishi from MST.TV here, and in today's video we're going to do a little bit of a discussion about buyouts, particularly bad buyouts. So the term buyout is a pretty common term thrown around a lot in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. Typically it refers to when all of the reasonably priced copies of a card that are available for purchase online are bought out, usually by a few people, which in turn drives the price of the card upwards, as there aren't very many copies available to purchase on the market anymore. So we can look, for example, at a card like Test Tiger, which I covered in a Market Watch not too long ago. So the ultimate rare version of this card was very recently bought out, and the cheapest near mint copy available on TCG Player is sitting at like $85. I think there are a couple for $70 or so, but those ones are lightly played. Near mint copy, cheapest $85. This card was obviously not that high of a price point all the time. TCG Player actually shows that the card has a market price of only around $16. So when the Glad Piece support was first announced for Chaos Impact, someone went and bought out all of the ultimate rare copies of Test Tiger on the market, which drove the price upwards. Whoever did that will probably be okay if they're paying around $16 a copy, because the card price is probably going to settle at around $40 to $50 when more of them are listed back onto the market as we get closer and closer to the release of Chaos Impact. However, not all buyouts go this way. Some of them are essentially just a waste of money, as people buy out copies of a card that aren't necessarily like deserving of the attention. Some players or investors, they may make a choice because they are misinformed, or they're over eager just to buy something out, or just overall they do a poor job of speculating and using their own brains when trying to understand the market and the card game. Buyouts can be very dangerous in that if you try and buy out the wrong thing, you're essentially dumping your money into something that you're not ever really going to get any value back from. For example, let's look at the very recent buyout of Triple Burst Dragon. Someone decided to try and buy that card out thinking, hey, this card is necessary in a lot of Guard Dragon plays, which is true, but they failed to consider that it was very likely to get reprinted in the upcoming Rocket Structure deck. And when that deck does come out, it's very clearly going to tank the price of the card considerably. A big part of why Triple Burst Dragon was so high in the first place is because it only had the one print and wasn't reprinted in the previous year's Megaton. However, it is in the structure deck this year, so whoever bought that card out is very unlikely to get back even half of what they probably spent on the buyout. So what we're going to do in this video, we are going to look at 5 of the absolute worst buyouts to ever happen in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Let's get started. Alright guys, so first up we are talking about Ancient Leaf. So a lot of you guys probably haven't even heard of this card. When Master Rule 4 was first announced to be coming out, a lot of people were really excited. We were just finishing up with Zodiac format, which a lot of people weren't happy with because of how dominant the deck was. People were speculating big time that some huge rule changes were coming soon, and one of those speculated changes was that people would be starting the game with 10,000 life points rather than 8,000. I guess in order to like theoretically have games last longer, who knows? Supposedly this rule change was leaked, right? But as a result, everyone decided to go out and buy copies of Ancient Leaf, thinking that this would essentially turn into Pot of Greed at the cost of 2,000 life points. Obviously, this never happened, so people were left with a bunch of copies of Ancient Leaf and never really able to do anything with them, unless like there was like some Aromage hype or something, maybe. Who knows? I don't think that ever really took off. Anyways, I think it's pretty obvious that this was going to be a bust even then, especially since even if, like, let's consider if Konami made that starting life point change, they would have had like the sense to either ban or errata Ancient Leaf, maybe requiring you to have 12,000 life points instead of 9,000. So yeah, definitely an example of players not really using their brains when speculating, which you guys are probably going to notice is actually a recurring trend in this video. Alright, so next up, we're actually going to talk about 2 cards here, which are Turupurun and Frog the Jam. Some of you guys may know Frog the Jam as Slime Toad, as the card was actually errated with a name change when it was reprinted in its OTS pack, so that they could stop having to include frog monsters except Frog the Jam on all the frog cards. So these 2 cards were hyped up because they are level 2 water type Aqua monsters in the TCG. There's another one, I believe it's Psychic Kappa, but that card came from Magic Ruler, which is like a main set. Both of these cards had very limited printings. Turipurun was only available in Tournament Pack 2, and I believe that's still the only printing. And Frog the Gem was only available at the time as a McDonald's promo. Apparently in the OCG, people were playing around with a deck that focused just around making Totally Awesome and using these vanilla monsters to do so. So using cards like Rescue Rabbit or Unexpected Die to bring out these monsters and make Totally Awesome with them. However, the deck never really panned out in the TCG, largely because at the time Rescue Rabbit was limited in the TCG, but it was at 3 in the OCG. But like, unfortunately, that didn't stop people from hyping it up and buying out these cards. Even without the buyouts, these cards were pretty hard to find, just because each of them was like really old and they were from such obscure sets. This buyout probably wasn't as bad as some of the others on the list, because it was possible like that the deck could have seen the same success in the TCG as it did in the OCG. Nevertheless, it's included here because people were like, just because of the price point, people were paying upwards of like $15 for these random old vanilla monsters. And to make matters worse, Frog the Gem was reprinted as Slime Toad a couple months later, which ultimately just killed whatever residual value people who had bought Frog the Gem were holding on to. Okay, so another section here where we're discussing multiple cards in the same part, but all of these cards kind of fit like the same theme for the same reason. So when Master Rule 4 was first announced and Link monsters were first introduced to the game, there was still a lot of uncertainty about how the new mechanic would work. Specifically, a lot of people hadn't distinguished between the extra monster zone and main monster zone, since prior to Master Rule 4, everything was just referred to as monster zones. People like knew that you had to summon a monster to the extra monster zone first, but they didn't know that it would be referred to as something different. So people then figured that they would be able to use a card like Ground Collapse, and you could like summon a monster to your extra monster zone, and then you could Ground Collapse your opponent's extra monster zone, and that would be enough to like stop them from using the extra deck altogether. Obviously, this isn't the way things worked out. The two zones were like given separate names, and these cards were basically just as unplayable as they were before. So these were definitely really bad buyout targets. I guess like the one saving grace for some of these people is that Ultimate Rare Ojama Kings are actually really hard to find, because you can use them in like Goat format to stop your opponent from using Scapegoat, and you can summon it off of Metamorphosis. So maybe that'll save some value for some people. But yeah, I feel like honestly, it should have been really obvious that you wouldn't be able to just use one card to essentially like domain lock your opponent. But I guess like people were overly excited about the opportunity to stop your opponent from playing the game just completely for free. Alright, so the last two here are probably two of the most cringeworthy buyouts that I've ever seen happen on the Yu-Gi-Oh market. So Pokey Draco is a pretty simple card. You normal summon it and then you search for another copy of itself. It is a fire dragon type monster. So what you could theoretically do is summon this card, search another copy, pitch it with Blaster to pop a card, and then you banish it alongside another dragon to summon another dragon ruler. This was like the idea in theory, but actually like in reality the card never saw any play. There were just like so many better cards that you could use in dragon rulers. There were so many better dragon alternatives. I mean, like Monster Reborn was legal, and a lot of people weren't playing Monster Reborn just because it was so unnecessary. So that should give you an idea of what kind of power cards that deck had in that format. So no one actually topped with this card. No one posted any lists or anything that like had won a regionals or anything like that. This card actually jumped up in price because it was a targeted buyout done by the Facebook group known as Zodiac Duelists. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the group, it's a pretty notorious group for having a lot of trolls and whatnot. So what they did was they decided to buy out all the cheap copies of this card that were available online and artificially just drive the price up. And theoretically it worked because afterwards the cheapest ones available were like $5 or something. But the real problem with it was that no one really bought the card after that. Like no one was really willing to pay that $5 for the most part. Like I think what happened is a lot of people looked at Pokey Draco, they called it a bad buyout, and then they just left it alone, leaving the people who had bought out Pokey Draco sitting with who knows how many copies of it. when it would never really go back up in price. I'm not saying that like nobody bought it, right? Like what probably happened is someone took it to locals and they did sell it to someone, convincing that person that this was going to be the next like big card or whatever. But like for the most part, while it was like a really interesting attempt, this buyout just had bad like labeled all over it. Alright, and finally we have what is probably the most notorious buyout in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is the buyout of Spell Chronicle. So in looking at what cards or decks are going to be good in an upcoming format, a lot of the time, people turn to what some people would refer to as pro players. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Players that have a proven track record of consistently topping events and performing well. And one of the main ways to do this is by checking online for deck lists that have topped recent events. However, because of how big social media is, a lot of these like pro players have their own social media accounts, which allows them to come into contact directly with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community. So a name that a lot of you guys have probably heard is Jeff Jones. He's a very well-known Yu-Gi-Oh! Player with like 2 YCS wins and a UDS championship amongst his many other tops. So what happened is he made a post on Facebook stating that he was looking to pick up copies of Spell Chronicle. And then there was another post, it was like a screenshot from Dueling Network. I don't remember if it was Jeff Jones or not, but it showed a really broken board setup with like a lot of negates or something. And one of the cards that was on the board is Spell Chronicle, and it was like supposedly hyping up how good the card was. If you guys have read Spell Chronicle, it's like a continuous spell. You discard your entire hand, then you banish 5 spells or traps from your deck. And then for every 2 spells your opponent activates, your opponent picks one of those cards for you and adds it to your hand. Like this card is dependent on your opponent activating spells, and it has a really, really big cost, and there's no guarantee that you get the card that you want. So like there is no way that this card was like good or anything, right? Like I think theoretically you could use it to pitch the BA or Shadal monsters in your hand at the time and proc their effects. But like, no, this card was like absolutely awful. But what happened is because so many Yu-Gi-Oh! Players just blindly follow the actions and words of pro players, Spell Chronicle actually did get bought out, and for a very short window, this card was like at cheapest $10 online. There are a lot of stories that I've like read in doing research and stuff of people paying like $3 or $4 just for this card. I don't know how many people actually paid up to that $10 price point, but that is absolutely incredible that people would pay this amount of money for a card that is so clearly bad just because a pro player has vouched for the card. Like, in my opinion, this is kind of unfortunate in that it reveals a lot about Yu-Gi-Oh! Players or vendors who just don't sit and think about the card or the game themselves, and they just react kind of blindly and follow the trends of the market and like the words of like these pro Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. So looking back, I would easily call this the worst buyout in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Alright guys, that is it for this video. I know that initially it may not seem like buying one of these cards out is like that much money lost, but if you think about the sheer quantity of cards that are available on the market multiplied by like the quarter that you're probably paying for a copy of this card, it's actually a lot of money to buy out this really bad card. So you're losing a lot of value if you aren't able to sell the card afterwards. If I'm missing any like really big buyouts that were just like completely awful, please let me know about them down in the comment section below. I know I definitely didn't cover all of them here today. If you guys enjoyed the discussion, please make sure to give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content from MST.TV, make sure that you hit that subscribe button. And until next time, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.